Hi, welcome to this video. So this is the first in the pre-session video for session 2. You should have been fresh out of session 1 with Jeff, and we hope that you appreciated his introduction to systems and complexity. And we are going to be introducing to you the foundations of outcome mapping. So we'll give you an overview of outcome mapping and get into some of the steps of outcome mapping. So my name's Simon Hearn. You probably will have known me from previous sessions. I'm the coordinator of the outcome mapping learning community and producer for most of the workshop.
Hi everyone, my name is Kaya Ambrose. I'm an outcome mapping learning community steward as well as being an independent evaluation consultant, and I'm based in Ottawa, Canada.
Great. So we're going to get started. So this is the first video of this set. There will be 3 videos for you to watch in this section. The first one then is the overview of outcome mapping. And the place to start really is what we consider as the sort of conventional approach to logic models. You might be familiar with this language that you'll see on the slide: inputs, activities, outputs, outcome, and impact. And when we're developing logic models, sometimes there's an assumption that these things follow linearly, that we do a certain activity, it produces outputs, and that leads to outcomes, and eventually we achieve our impact. The problem is that in real life, social and policy change, which when it boils down is what we're trying to achieve in our projects, and in whatever kind of project we're involved in, we're trying to achieve some kind of social or policy change. And that doesn't follow that linear pathway that I showed in the previous slide. Social and policy change is complex because it involves a confluence of different actors and factors and perspectives. It's unpredictable. It's independent of our project ambition and duration. It doesn't matter that our project runs for this 2-year period. Change is happening before and it will continue to happen after. Change is non-linear, so it doesn't follow that a certain amount of effort will produce a predictable amount of output. There's emergence and discontinuity. Things happen at different times. Change is also two-way. So as we seek to influence and change those around us, we are also changed. And we have to bear that in mind. Change is also beyond our control. But in outcome mapping and the way that we'll be introducing to you, it is within our influence, and that is really what we're going to be exploring more with you. So the model of the real world, this complexity that we've described, that you probably also explored a bit more with Jeff in the first session, it doesn't fit that step-by-step model that a lot of us are used to. In practice, it actually looks like this, where you run some activities, they don't produce the outputs that you want. You produce different outputs maybe, and they go on and influence sometimes surprising outcomes. Sometimes they don't produce any outcomes. There's a lot more uncertainty, unpredictability, and at the end of the day, we get a messy picture like this. So what do we do? This cartoon may be familiar to some of you. It's kind of done the rounds a few times, but it sort of speaks about what the challenge is in this context. We can be quite confident on sort of the stuff at the early stage. This is sort of the beginning of the equation here. What's going into our projects, what we're doing with our projects, the decisions we can make about our resources. And then we might even be fairly confident about some end change. We might be able to measure some high-level indicators that tell us, school attendance is changing, or malaria incidence in the district is reducing. Some of these high-level indicators can tell us that something is happening that's good. But what's going on in between? What's going on here? This is where a miracle is happening, and it's that people often describe as a missing middle or a black box. But it's the messy relationships, it's the interactions, it's the influence and the sort of change that's going on to produce those end impacts that we're able to measure. And it's in that space there that outcome mapping focuses. And we're going to be spending most of our time exploring what happens in that black box. So over to you, Kaya.
Thanks, Simon. So this is a really distilled definition of outcome mapping, kind of very, at its stripping away everything at its basics. What is this about? What is outcome mapping? And as you may have heard in introductions from Richard and Mariam, in its essence, it's a participatory method. It's meant to be a participatory method and approach for planning, monitoring, and evaluation. As Simon's just highlighted, it really hones in on changes in behavior of those with whom the project or program is working with in various capacities. And it's also an approach that is really geared towards social learning and organizational learning. And that kind of links back in with the participatory element as well. And it does that to support systemic changes in a given context. And this kind of very distilled and brief definition sets the stage for the key elements and concepts and principles of outcome mapping that we'll go into further in this presentation. Something else I just want to highlight with this slide and the fact that outcome mapping focuses in on behavioral changes as outcome mapping defines outcomes, which we'll also explore more carefully, is that it becomes a good hinge or a good point for outcome mapping to work well with the logic model and with other structures such as results-based management. This is a question we often get in trainings, outcome mapping trainings. How can I make this complementary to the often very static constructs that I have to work with in a project or a program for my planning, monitoring, and evaluation? So it's a nice point where it helps to unpack and breathe life into a logic model. Next slide, please, Simon. So with that distilled definition, what outcome mapping helps us to do is pay attention to the journey that we're on with an initiative. So it helps us to pay attention to it in terms of documenting it, assessing and revising perhaps the final destination or key markers along the way based on that documentation and based on those observations. And along the way as well, helping us to improve our own capacity to, as a project or a program, an organization or a group of individuals who are continuing along this journey, improve our capacity to be on that journey and to support others who are on that journey, that change pathway. So we put a lot of emphasis and focus and effort on the journey part with outcome mapping. We've got a destination in mind, and we may bring in other evaluation approaches and methodologies and tools to do that longer term destination measurement, but outcome mapping really wants to focus on how we get there. So this ties back in with the cartoon that Simon presented. And I'll just go over, Simon, the principles if you want to go to the next slide. So as I said, that brief definition, that distilled definition sets us up to explore further the principles that are inherent in outcome mapping. So we like to say that if we are using outcome mapping, there's an assumption that the user, the individuals within a project or a program, be it the implementing organizations or the team, that they somehow embrace and understand and apply and agree with these principles. The first one is social, policy, and systems changes depend on changes in human behavior. And you might have explored this already with Jeff's presentation. The second principle that's inherent in outcome mapping is that individuals contribute to their own well-being. But that contribution, for that contribution, we have to look at the third principle as well. That contribution to their own well-being is so dependent on relationships and what those relationships and those dynamics within relationships look like and how they evolve. And these three principles, as I said, are almost we assume that these things are inherent when a group or a team or an organization uses outcome mapping, and they're approaching it, and the use of outcome mapping embodies these three principles and is thinking about these three principles. And the tools that we'll go through in the next two sessions will unpack some of these principles into very practical tools as well. Next slide, please, Simon, unless you wanted to add anything else. And I believe I'm passing it over to you now.
Yeah, so following on from the three principles, we have four core concepts. And these are sort of foundational concepts on which the practice of outcome mapping builds. I'll go through the four individually, but you'll see them there on the slide. So the first one is that there is a limit to our influence, and we call that the sphere of influence. And to sort of construct that for you, we use these the idea of these three nested spheres that come from Steve Montague's work from way back in 2001 and used first in outcome mapping by Steph Dupre. And we can think of the first sphere as the sphere of control. This is the program environment where we have control over the decisions we make, where we put our resources, which activities we'll run, who we're going to invite to our different activities. That sits within a wider world, the world that we're most concerned with. We call this the sphere of concern. And within this world, there are people that matter to us, the ones that we care most about, that we want to see some kind of improvement in their life, improvement in well-being, improvement in organizations, improvement in the policy landscape around them. That's the raison d'etre of why our program, our project exists. But we can't reach all those people, usually. In most situations, we can't reach everyone that we want to benefit from this project. So there is between the sphere of control and the sphere of concern, there's a boundary that defines our sphere of interest, our sphere of influence. Sorry. The sphere of influence is then the part of the world that our program can work with. We can build relationships with, we can interact, meet with, we can influence. And that's going to be defined by different things. It's going to be defined by the resources that we have. It's going to be defined by the existing relationships. It's going to be defined by politics, perhaps. It's going to be defined by what our key skills are, what we're offering. So thinking about your sphere of influence can help you understand the space in which your project will be working. And that's the first core concept, is the idea of a sphere of influence. When we can actually overlay these common results categories that I showed in that first slide on here, and roughly speaking, you're going to see your inputs, activities, and outputs as part of your sphere of control. Your impact is what you see in your sphere of concern, and then the outcomes fit into this sphere of influence space. And this is really part of the definition of outcomes in outcome mapping, is that they are results that are produced within your sphere of influence. So the second core concept is defining boundary partners. It's that we can identify actors, people, organizations, or groups who exist on the boundary between our world, what our sphere of influence, and our sphere of concern. So you're going to, for example, you're going to have some groups that you ultimately care about. These might be children in school. They might be women's groups. They might be private sector organizations. They might be policymakers. But there's going to be a group who you ultimately care about, that you want to see some kind of improvement with. And around them are going to be lots of others who influence them. They might be part of the sort of government infrastructure. They might be private organizations. They might even be service providers and NGOs. There might be other communities that will somehow have an effect on those that you ultimately care about. Now, amongst those are going to be some that fit within your sphere of influence, who you can build a relationship, maybe you already have a relationship with. They're going to be your boundary partners, the ones that you can work with to influence and support and ultimately improve the lives of those you ultimately care about. And what you do with your boundary partners, those are your outputs. So what you do and what you produce to work with your boundary partners is your outputs. What your boundary partners do as a result of that is that's your outcome. Your outcome is how your boundary partners are working differently. And usually that's in order to support those that you ultimately care about. So you can start to see this as a bit of a systems map that we're building up here. So this is how we define boundary partners. It's those that are on the boundary between your influence and your sphere of concern, and they're the ones upon which success ultimately lies. We distinguish boundary partners from the sort of more generic term stakeholder in this way. So we understand stakeholders being a very broad group of anyone who's interested in, affected by, or whose action will affect the intervention's outcomes. There's usually a lot of them. You can make massive lists, and you don't or you can't work with them all. So with boundary partners, they're distinguished because they are crucial to contribute to the vision of the program. We want to see them change. There's an intent to support, to see some kind of change with those groups. And we have an opportunity to work with them or otherwise influence them. And there's going to be few enough of them that we can monitor that change and see them and support them through that journey of change. We'll talk more about boundary partners in a subsequent video. The third core concept is outcomes as changes in behavior. Kaya already mentioned this. In outcome mapping, we describe outcomes in terms of behavior change. And when we talk about behavior, we mean something very, very sort of visual, observable, and hence why we've got this list of terms here, all of which are very good things to aspire to. And we would see these things a lot in the proposals we write, in the reports we write, in the log frames we build. And we need these things. But the problem with them all is that we can't see when these things happen. We can't see greater awareness. What would it look like if there was increased collaboration? I wouldn't know unless we break that down. We break that down into something that we would see. So what would we see if an organization was offering equal access? They would start to do things differently. So we can start to describe that. So in outcome mapping, we avoid terms like this, especially the one at the end, strengthen capacity. We see that so often, but what does that mean? So we avoid that language, and instead we ask ourselves, what would we see if this was happening? And we'll be exploring this more in a later video on outcome challenges and progress markers. The fourth core concept is contribution, not attribution. And by this we mean in outcome mapping we're interested and exploring our contribution to change. We're not trying to attribute results to a project. And this is about seeing our work and our project as part of a broader system where there are other actors also working, also contributing to different results. Maybe there's competition, maybe there's collaboration. But the point is that we are only one factor amongst others that are affecting change. And our contribution may be high, or it may be moderate, or it may be low. So you can, with this idea of contribution, you can already start to see how does your work fit in with what others are already doing. And we may not know our contribution until a final evaluation, if those are the questions that you ask in an evaluation. It's not something that's easy to answer. I'll hand back to Kaya just to finish us off.
Thanks, Simon. We hope that this gave you a taster for what we'll be digging into next in the next two sessions. We do encourage you to take a look at the paper that was written by the Outcome Mapping Learning Community Stewards that delves deeper into these elements, into the key principles and concepts. Just to wrap up this session, you may have seen this graphic already, but this is what we'll be going into in the next two sessions, especially those three highlighted steps on the left-hand side. So overall, outcome mapping is made up of three stages, as you see in the diagram, with 12 steps overall. And in practice, these are for guidance only. This is not a lockstep progression of steps that you need to take for better projects. So it's really important to associate those different steps, particularly the steps in the intentional design, with the principles and the concepts that we've just gone over as well, because those really breathe life into the steps. And the steps are comprised of very practical and participation-oriented tools for you to apply. And we'll be going into those in the next few days. So the intentional design and the steps within the intentional design, despite what the name says, design, these steps are also very important for considering and using when you're doing monitoring and evaluation as well. We'll be doing an overview of the vision and mission, and you'll have some exercises and homework to do around that. And we'll have some discussion around those first steps. And then we'll be doing quite a bit of work, and in subsequent sessions with staff, you'll be going into outcome challenges and progress markers as well. So the boundary partners outcome challenges and progress markers are the real kind of meaty bits of the intentional design that we'll spend some time on. And we'll finish up our session with strategy maps and some extra homework or optional viewing around organizational practices. Okay, thank you. And we will see you in the next video around vision, mission, and boundary partners.